Welcome to Franklin Covey's C-Suite Conversations. My name is Patrick Ledden, and each week I have the opportunity to sit down and talk to an executive leader. I learn about their life and their work and their career, what they've learned along the way, the struggles they've overcome, and the successes they've achieved, all with one thought in mind, to help you, the listener, think through your life and your work. Today, I'm joined by Atif Rafiq. In his career as a C-suite leader, he has led over 10,000 people, and he knows a lot about knowledge work and digital transformation. Trust me, you're going to want to grab something to write with, sit back and take some notes as Atif and I have a C-suite conversation. Atif Rafiq, thank you so much for joining me today for a C-suite conversation.
Patrick, it's a pleasure to join you.
It's such a pleasure to have you here today. I told you on the front end as we were talking before we started recording that it's helpful for everybody to know a little bit about your story. I have the benefit of reading through your bio, and folks, get ready. You're going to be pretty energized by some things you hear today. But instead of me reading the bio, which is exceptionally boring, why don't we have you just tell a little bit about yourself?
Well, Patrick, I've had three metamorphoses in my career. I started very early on in the internet and was fortunate to be part of companies like Yahoo when they were on the rise, and Amazon as a general manager of a business unit. And my first metamorphosis came in 2013. That was the year where Mark Andreessen coined the phrase software is eating the world. And pretty much every Fortune 500 company said, hey, we need a little bit of tech DNA. So I became the person who moved from Amazon into kind of a company not known for tech. I became the first chief digital officer in the history of the Fortune 500. I was lucky to have that role at McDonald's and help them kind of really use technology to drive their customer experience. That began sort of a 10-year run in the C-suite of large, well-known companies, McDonald's, after McDonald's, Volvo, and then in a president role at MGM Resorts. That was great until it wasn't. And then 11 years into that, I hit a point where I said, well, how do I scale what I've learned? And I am now on my third kind of stage of things where I'm back to being an entrepreneur, and I'm kind of productizing everything I've learned through a company, but also through thought leadership and writing books and things like that.
Wonderful. Thanks for walking through that. I'm going to dig into a few things you talked about. You talked about these three different, metamorphoses. I read something recently about the idea that taking a pivot or kind of moving jobs every 5 years now was the argument they were making in the article. And as you talked about that kind of first chunk of your career and the next 11 years or so of your career kind of in those chunks, have you found that, not that 5 years is an optimal number, but have you found for yourself that there is a number or a period of time where you feel like, okay, I've gotten from the organization what I can get developmental wise, and I feel like I've given? Do you feel like there's those periods? And if so, how do you recognize they're coming? Because there may be some people listening who might be in those exact shoes.
I think that regardless of where you are in your career journey, whether you're a few years out of school or 25 years into a career, I think you always need a new challenge somewhere in the 2 to 3 year range. And that can take a lot of different forms. That can be a different challenge in the same organization. But what I see happening is, in a new challenge, the first year being pretty a steep learning curve and some low points, and not sure if you're really going to be able to step up to the challenge, and then sort of getting to the top of the hill and being able to see some perspective after about a year and maybe 2 years in, kind of it being a little bit more, not on automatic pilot, but something which you can definitely handle, and then you're looking for more. And so I think for organizations, what that means is thinking ahead around talent planning and what's the next 2 moves for this person. Mm-hmm. Being on 2 public company boards, I know that that's what public companies do. They look at their high performers, and they're always thinking 2 moves ahead. And it's never a guarantee, but at least that you create a pathway to retain somebody. But I think I think individuals kind of expect that in sort of this day and age, especially when they're pushing themselves, they're very motivated, they pick up new skills, they're learning a lot, they're maybe out at events and kind of learning new trends and things like that.
I love that you mentioned, I jotted it down about, sometimes those moves can happen within your own organization. I think the gentleman who hosted this podcast before I did, he kind of stewarded the first 100 or so episodes, spent 20 plus years at Franklin Covey. And he would talk about how yeah, it's 20 plus years in the same organization, but there's lots of different challenges, lots of different roles I've taken on. And in the process of doing it, it's actually kind of multiple experiences within the same organization. I just love your thoughts on that, because it's easy to say, well, I'm done here, I'm going to put my resume out. But sometimes it might be like, there's a lot more that I can learn within the four walls, if you will, of our organization.
Some of the most senior people I know in corporate America are folks who began maybe as a field manager in a region. I'm thinking literally about McDonald's, field manager in a region of the United States, and maybe covering four states, and and then they took over like the Midwest, and then maybe we sent them to run a country, not the United States because it's a really huge market. It's half of McDonald's, but maybe a smaller country. They came back to the United States, and they might be running the McDonald's USA business. That is, those are real examples. That's what good looks like from a talent planning perspective, where you have that Venn diagram of, high performer plus kind of methodical talent planning. And that's what good looks like. I don't think we do that enough. I mean, I think that's, probably 10-20% of people get that kind of outcome. So if there are ways to do more of it, I think that's better for the employee, is also better for the business.
Absolutely. As you were saying that, I jotted down, you're talking about these different roles. It's like you're getting different exposure, you're getting different experiences, you're getting a different education, if you will, in the process of doing that. And who doesn't love a good alliteration, right? So there's a few things as you go through that. And I love that it's more about the growth personally and professionally and organizationally that can happen by looking at different ways to navigate through that. But it sounds like, and oftentimes it's really about just being curious and willing to put yourself in new positions, regardless of if you stay in an organization or move organizations. It's that mindset.
Yeah, and I think from the other end of it, it's a marketplace out there, and sometimes companies don't have the bandwidth to do that for everybody. So employees who are motivated want to develop their own skills, and they will test the marketplace, because ultimately the marketplace decides. And if
Yeah.
the internal market doesn't value the employee the way the external market does, then the employee will make a logical move and kind of make that trade.
Yeah.
And so that's what kind of keeps the internal marketplace honest, if you will.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. As you were going through that, you were chatting about thinking two positions ahead or two opportunities ahead, that type of thinking. As I was reading through your bio and kind of prepping for this, I'm like, this is a person who just seems to be able to see around corners. I mean, you have the ability in your career to, say like a community roles like chief digital officer, or exposing to AI long before other folks had, and seeing where it's going. Do you think, is that just something that's wired in your brain about the ability to kind of see where the puck is going if you follow hockey, or whatever the ball is going, whatever analogy you want to use? Or have you learned to do that? Or I'd just love to hear your thoughts about the ability to kind of look up and see where things are going.
Well, I think having vision is one thing. Making calculated bets, though, I think is the core. So, for example, when I transitioned from Amazon to McDonald's, I said, look, there is definitely some risk here because there's no known path. Like, is a chief digital officer like a role where, maybe no other organizations will need it besides McDonald's? That didn't turn out to be true. Is it a role where it doesn't have upward mobility because they box you into a technology box? That didn't happen to be true. But I couldn't know that in the beginning. So I had to quantify the downside, which was, well, I could come back to a place like Amazon or Google and be a general manager of one of the business units because
Mm-hmm.
I'm a known commodity. So the downside wasn't tremendous, but the upside seemed like, very, very significant. So to me, it's one thing to see that something could be huge and then really try and parse like is this a calculated bet? And that's really paid off for me. Like my first career move, to be honest with you, I was a low man on the totem pole at Goldman Sachs. I was a financial analyst. I wasn't in love with finance and spreadsheets. I really did like building products. So somehow AOL said, okay, let's give this guy a spot on the team. And this was very early on in the days of the internet. I had to move from a place that I knew well, and I grew up in New York City, to a small town in Virginia, and I also needed to take a pay cut, half the pay actually. But to me, those were great calculated moves because if they didn't work out, I could go back to doing what I already did, and the downside wasn't significant. But if this internet thing turned out to be interesting, which obviously it was ridiculously interesting, then it would be kind of, it would define my entire career. So calculated bets is kind of the way what I put my finger on.
I've spent the last 11 years before I recently rejoined Franklin Covey. I've had a long-term relationship with them, but I recently left a position as a professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. And a lot of students there go into investment banking. And, one of the prerequisites really is do you have a love for finance and spreadsheets? So I'm just curious, did you have you thought you had a love for it and then you got into it and you realized, oh, I just kind of liked it. I want to date, not get married. Or was it a situation where you realized, boy, there's lots of other things. I just love to know what got into your mind and what made you realize you didn't have that degree of love?
Well, I think, I have a math background and I do like spreadsheets to some extent, like I'm building a company now. So I like to look at like valuation and exit values and all that stuff. But it's not the primary thing I think that creates value in our society or in industries. It's really knowing the customer needs, building the product, getting good product market fit, like having people willingly want to talk about, wow, this is an amazing product. You should go check this out.
Hmm.
And so that to me was always more interesting than, transactions, so to speak. So 2 years into it, I was like, this is early days in the career. Can I see myself, like I should do what I love. And I don't know what I love, but I think this, tech products could be very interesting. So I got into that, I got a flavor of it, and I did fall in love with it. And that sort of set the tone for everything I did, because even thinking about a car as a digital product, or the ordering experience within a McDonald's restaurant or a kiosk as a digital product, that all the seeds for that were planted, working at places like AOL and Yahoo and Amazon, which of course are all about digital products.
Absolutely. It's funny too, though, starting off in positions like you mentioned at Goldman Sachs and things like that. And there may be some people in their journey right now that are in it and those type of roles, getting on those types of ladders early on, regardless of which particular organization is or which particular role. You don't have to be, working with models, for example, in the finance side, but you can be doing other things that are kind of just giving you good foundational experience about how business operates, how work is done, how decisions are made. Then you can choose I really want to work on the tech side more. I want to be an operator or whatever it might be, kind of stems from those good foundational experiences. Do you feel that's fair?
100%. I mean, that's the main reason is because I couldn't define, business from from anything else, and so the only way to know something is to try something and do it. And there's really no downside in a consulting or kind of an investment banking job with a known commodity. I mean, you'll pick up some great skills, and then you can decide where to take it, as long as you have courage, because the courage to not be locked into, well, what exactly will this turn into in 7 years? I mean, I know if I go to medical school and I pass some exams, there's a known path. I can, and this is what this type of physician makes. This is a very known path. But if you are in the business field, one thing might lead to another, and you don't know exactly what that will be. So I think as long as you have the courage to explore and try some things, and find that fit of really what doesn't feel like work, it feels like, enjoyment in terms of like the day to day, that's generally going to pay out for people. But yeah, I do recommend, like, if you don't know what that is, trying something where you get some good core skills.
It's as you were saying that, I was just thinking about this curiosity, like not knowing where the journey is going to go, how things are going to play out. There's an excitement that comes from that as well, of not necessarily knowing. Like everybody listening to this podcast can't, if you were to write down where do you think you'll be sitting 10 years from now, I would say most of you might miss the guess. But it's part of just trying to figure out like the journey and make some decisions along the way that are probably directionally moving you in a certain place. But one thing you mentioned is, you talked a couple of times about calculated risks. And I always love to hear how leaders think about the decisions they make and the choices they make. When you say calculated risk, like take me into your head. How do you go about making those types of choices and decisions?
Yeah, I think, I mean, probably best demonstrated through examples.
Yeah.
If I go to McDonald's, it's a well-known company. However, it's not really like a linear progression of like, okay, well, what does this have to do with Amazon? Is this the next Amazon kind of thing, right? So it kind of is a little bit of a non sequitur in terms of like, well, why did you leave tech? So there would be some downside if this chief deal officer thing didn't pan out. But that being said, I could, being a known commodity as a general manager or running a business unit, I could probably go back to that. Maybe I'd lose some time, a year or two or something like that. However, this could be very transformative for a lot of businesses, whether you're a resort or a hotel or an airline. You need to think about the customer experience. You need to rework everything from backward from the customer. You need to now embrace innovation at a different pace. Your competitors are not the known industry players only. It's also, players from the tech space as well.
Mm.
So if you can kind of understand how to not only change the vision of the company or add to the vision of the company, but also change how the company works, what kind of talent is there, the operating models, the ways of working. Now you become somebody who has the skills of the future for the Fortune 500. And that has upside because people might want you to maybe run the commercial side of the company
Yeah.
or marketing as well. And those things did turn out to be the case for me, where they gave me basically most of the company to run at some of these organizations. So the upside was there, and that I was very motivated by that upside. But I knew that there was a risk here of maybe 2 years of going back to where I started.
Well, as you went through your decision making process there and kind of calculated risk conversation, let's talk about decision making at scale, because I think that one thing that stood out to me from your career is the ability to optimize organizations' ability to make decisions, and sprinting when it comes to decision sprints. And just talk a little bit about that, because I read an article years ago. Now, this would, if you want to find this one, go back like way in the archives out there. There was an HBR article years ago. I think the title of it was "Who's Got the D." And it was all about executing strategy requires decisions to be made at the proper levels of organizations, and the idea that when you can't figure out who has the D, as in the ability to make a decision, it tends to kind of gum the works. And you probably have all seen that. And sometimes when trust gets low in organizations, we add more layers to decision making, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, 2 years ago I only had to have one person sign off on a hiring decision. Now I've got 8. There's all these types of things around decisions that really impede progress in so many ways. I just love to hear you just kind of riff, Atif, if you don't mind on decision making.
Well, I come from a very different perspective, Patrick. Like, I don't really pay attention to races or project charters with who's accountable for what. To me, I come from a very different perspective, meaning
Yep.
I look at, if companies are going to grow, they're going to have to get into new territory. They're going to have to not only innovate, but embrace new ideas or objectives that are very new. There's no roadmap for how to do these things. So they have to work through a ton of ambiguity, a ton of questions, a ton of uncertainty. And in order to do that well, not one corner of the company has enough knowledge or input to be able to get to the right direction. And so we need to harness the brain trust. People call that collective intelligence. And how do we get the collective intelligence of the organization moving around the most meaningful objectives or problems the company needs to solve in order to grow and remain relevant and thrive? That to me is something which has been more art than science. And necessity was the mother of invention for me at all the companies I mentioned, McDonald's, Volvo, and MGM, where they needed to get into new territory to grow. So how did I approach that? Well, I saw all these companies are really great at execution, what I call the downstream. Like, once the decision is made, things really go quite smoothly. But it's a very windy road to go from the raw idea or objective to confident decision making. So I decided to put in place new ways of working where, we would spend a lot of time on what I call the upstream work, which is defining the problem to solve, being comfortable that we have a lot of questions. In fact, getting all the questions up front with no answers, no rush to judgment, no opinions, but actually getting a great question list, and then making that actionable, doing what I call exploration, discovery, making that very purposeful, and then getting to the point where we have enough of a knowledge base to develop recommendations. Now, why I think that's very interesting when it's all put together is it allows for what I call decision meetings. Meaning, you have a big meeting, everyone's like really nervous and sweating. They think there's a lot at stake, and people are pretty much in violent agreement on the direction. And it's because the tables were set upstream. We did the right discovery, the right exploration, and the right problem framing. We sweated those things. We didn't have to sweat the decision.
How do you, I think everybody comes into a situation with some opinion on something, right? How they think, even if it's just their top of mind solution to something. How did you get organizations and teams to kind of suspend that judgment when it's so easy for everybody to say, oh, here's the problem, here's the answer. Here's what I've seen, here's the answer. And to say, sorry, hit pause on that. I mean, just psychologically, that's really tough to do sometimes.
It's about reframing it. So, for example, let's take an example. We're at McDonald's. Someone says, "Hey, we need to grow. I have a great idea. Let's do a subscription for coffee." The first thing you'll get is, one person loves it, one person hates it. The
Mm-hmm.
hater will say, "That would never work in the drive-through. It's going to take a long time to redeem your subscription, and it'll slow down the line, and the next three cars will won't be happy." Something like that. So that's a pretty opinionated thing, and it's an absolutely possible scenario. But if we reframe that as a question, which is to say, what would be, sort of the way in which the customer experience would occur in the drive-through? What does good look like for that? And is that better, or the same, or worse as if someone was just getting a coffee a la carte? That's a question that we need to go explore that. And that can have its own path. It could be some testing or some type of surveying or something like that, but we could go find out. We make the comment into a question and we make that actionable. So we actually go down that rabbit hole, but in a neutral way.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very hard, especially if the opinion is coming from someone senior, because senior people can shut things down. That psychological safety will definitely suffer, and you haven't enabled teams to do their best work. So my advice to leaders is to focus on a calibration approach versus a control approach. You got to be very careful with what you say and how opinionated you are, but you can calibrate the thinking. Have you thought about this? What about, is this a blind spot? Have you thought about that? Give that input and let the team do the work to kind of get to the bottom of it from a neutral standpoint. I think that's sort of one thing, but it's eventually this does connect to my story, which is this is the thing I felt like I knew a lot about just because I was thrown in those situations. So I decided to scale what I know by writing about it, writing a book called Decision Sprint, and providing essentially the workflow for how to do this at scale.
As I was listening to you talk about, for example, the McDonald's discussion you had around regarding should we do some type of subscription service for coffee, and I'm just curious. At Franklin Covey, we often talk about like these hallmarks of greatness. So an organization that's, as we would say, is truly a great organization as a number of things that it delivers. So it delivers sustained superior results. So I can imagine there's for lack of a better phrase, the coffee filter around sustained superior results. Will this deliver the numbers today, tomorrow, and into the future? But then there's other elements like engaged employees. Like, what does this decision do to the employees and their loyalty to the organization? What does it do with the loyalty of our customers? Because we know that customers, when they're loyal, tend to come back and buy more and tell others and give feedback. And then also the distinctive contribution, the kind of the why we exist in this organization. Does this advance it or kind of pull back from that? And I just love to hear your thinking, and maybe even tied to your work in your book around what are the different filters or lenses you should think about when you're making decisions. Maybe that might be beyond a love for the spreadsheet.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I mean, and I think we're at that point in capitalism where we have to think more broadly about stakeholders. But I think from the employee perspective, working on new territory is something that grows skills. It may come with a lot of pressure and accountability of like, oh, this hasn't been figured out before. How do we make this work? There's some hard challenges here. But at the same time, if we enable teams, give them psychological safety, and they're able to work through the ambiguity and make a confident recommendation, that's really what people get energized by. So it creates a lot of, growth skills wise, but also feelings of accomplishment. So I think there is a very nice Venn diagram between what serves the interests of an organization, what serves the interests of employees when it comes to problem solving skills. I think this is obviously very timely with the advent of AI and the question around white collar jobs and whether we'll need them or how many of them we'll need. It's really it's about time we elevate problem solving skills, and no better way to do that than to attach it to helping the company helping the company grow. Um, this particular idea around a coffee subscription, of course, the real reason is McDonald's would do it if they ever did want to, is not to get $20 more a month per user, but to have some of those occasions lead to the purchase of a sandwich, which is really where the margin is. And so if you can solve for that and create a great customer experience and the numbers demonstrated, then it would be massive, right, at scale for the organization.
Absolutely. I am also a McDonald's veteran. I worked at McDonald's like when I was 16 and 17 years old. And I know from my own experience, do you want fries with that drink, right? The ability to add something additional once you're in the stores is an amazing thing. By the way, working there taught me a lot of things about, kind of how to behave as an employee, and just you can learn so much from every job you have in life. As you're thinking about organizational leaders out there, as we talk about organizational leaders, there's so much going on that we talk about technology-wise, and some phrases that we say, that some people have been saying for years. It's in everybody's mind today, whether it's AI or ChatGPT or whatever it might be. And some of those are just kind of introductory steps into the space. But if you're a leader and you're organizational leader, and you're trying to leverage and accelerate growth, what should you be thinking about, especially from the technology perspective, over the next 12 to 18 months?
I think it's how to integrate AI into the workflows, because let me paint two different pictures. One is
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, of course, there's these AI tools, anyone could use them. I mean, you might be in sixth grade, you might be the CEO of a Fortune 100, and that's democratized a lot of knowledge. And so, one picture is kind of one person sitting in the corner, interacting to learn more or elevate their thinking. And that's great, right? But it's really very different than the way work actually gets done in a company. And typically in organizations, there's a meeting, there's a cadence of meetings, there's different stakeholders, there's, in the old world, there's like stage gates if there's projects, but there's new names for those things from a road mapping perspective, decision making perspective. Integrating AI into that really hasn't happened. That is very different. That's like a 10x opportunity in my view. So, for example, you have a meeting with a working team and a stakeholder, and it's kind of a midpoint in the project, and it's not about asking for money or a specific recommendation. It's more like, oh, like you looked into it. What are you guys thinking? Imagine AI being able to calibrate, like, okay, here are potential blind spots. Here are some other considerations. Have we thought about this? Or just validating that the team did a great job of that. That is something which we can do today if we begin to integrate AI into the actual collaboration, the way work gets done. And even beyond that, not just with the public knowledge out there through the LLMs, but in terms of the enterprise knowledge that exists. Like, for example, somewhere in this company, someone has an amazing PowerPoint that really broke through thinking on a certain subject. Is that available to us? And as a working team in a different part of the company, does that information flow freely enough? Is the AI helping it flow into our thinking so we pick up some insight from another part of the company? There's a lot of friction in this stuff today, but in the future there won't be.
I noticed that I was in a meeting not that long ago, and there was just a conversation kind of going on, the meeting before the meeting conversation, checking in with folks. And somebody just mentioned a prompt that they put into, I think it was ChatGPT that they were using, and then how they started this conversation, how informative this conversation was with them based upon that dialogue. And I think there's kind of the one side that can be like through osmosis, employee to employee kind of pick something up, and there's this organic bubbling up that happens. But then there's also the other side of the coin, if you will, and it's kind of more the top down driven initiatives and the vision to see how this can enable something beyond a simple chat into something that's more profound and built into the workflows. You kind of pioneered the chief digital officer role. Do you see that there's other roles out there that leaders might be thinking about developing or building out to really future proof their organization?
I do think there will be new roles in an AI era, less like chief of this or chief of that, but more like skill set wise. So, for example, if, you know, a lot of the workflows of the teams are, happening through tools, then there's a lot of visibility like analytics around this initiative, this project. Is it stuck? They label it green or red, but is it really green or red?
Hmm.
And if it was green or red, like, why is it red? Like, what could be the possible issues? Maybe what are the blind spots? And beyond that, like, who do we need to bring in to the brain trust to unblock it? This is happens maybe half the time well in companies, but definitely slowly. But with tools and AI, we're going to be able to, I think, increase our velocity a lot of like, oh, where are we really on this thing that's important for the company? What would unblock it? Who might help unblock it? And then how can we bring them into the loop to really get the breakthrough? I think that's going to be an amazing future for businesses that kind of set up the right foundation.
I love the idea of bringing people into the brain trust, whether it's organizationally or even individually. Like, who am I bringing in to expand my thinking and help me, process or make a decision about something? You mentioned earlier on your writing on the topic of this. If people wanted to bring you more into their brain trust, what could they pick up? What could they read? What would they be exposed to?
Well, a year ago, I released the book. It's called Decision Sprint. Fortunately, it is a Wall Street Journal bestseller, and you can check it out at decisionsprint.com. I do a newsletter on LinkedIn. It's one of their top 50. It's called Rewire. So you can punch that in here. And then you can always check out my latest entrepreneurial endeavor. I have a co-founder, Mike, who's one of the first 5 engineers at Facebook. And as you mentioned, Patrick, 3.5 years ago, we took a leap of faith that AI would be a thing. We didn't know exactly how, but we put together basically a product to help teams do exploration and discovery. So when there's an idea or objective, to kind of do the exploration discovery well to unlock, good decisions. And that company is called Ritual, and you can check it out at ritual.work.
That's awesome. I'm going to ask you for one more piece of advice as we wrap up. I like to ask guests at the end to think about the people who are listening to the podcast, whether they're in the C-suite right now or they're earlier on in their career, they're somewhere in their journey, and they have some things they want to achieve. What would you suggest is a good, solid piece of advice that you can give someone that says, regardless of where you are on your journey, here's a really smart thing you should be thinking about or doing?
I think the number one thing I'm seeing these days is how you come across. So you have a certain resume or credentials and skills. And look, I think that's going to be, if you get the shot, all of that's going to be utilized. But people really want to know, what are you all about? Like, and often they want to understand that through vulnerability and times where things did not go well. So I think that the fact that, it's the reality of every human on the planet that sometimes things go well, and how did we respond to that? How did that make us better? I think this is the number one piece of advice, especially for young people. Perfection is not a thing. Whoever you're looking up to from a net worth perspective or from like a title perspective, that person has had a lot of ups and downs. And so, that vulnerability is okay. And provided that you actually learn from that and can show how that made you better, I think that would really separate you from the pack and make people want to team up and collaborate with you.
That's such great advice. I mentioned about teaching at school, and students occasionally would like look at my resume or look on LinkedIn and be like, "Hey, Professor Ledden, how do I get to be more like you or have a career like yours?" Which obviously I have to question their judgment from the first. Don't look to me. But the answer I often would give them is like, "You're seeing the highlights on the resume. Like, this is the stuff that actually, got over the goal line. What you're not seeing is we're actually learned most of the lessons, which is in all the white space on the resume. Like, what happened between these positions, or what did I learn along the way?" And that's exactly what you're saying there. And in that moment is the chance to realize, like, hey, what the person you're looking up to, they struggled and they fell down sometimes. And your ability to embrace that level of realization within yourself and be vulnerable about it is really helpful at times to help you be more effective. Is that a fair way of kind of encapsulating that?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you get the best and brightest at Vanderbilt. It's an amazing school, and you get highly motivated people. Um, the only thing that we all have in common, those of us who are very motivated, is that there will be ups and downs, and those downs are something that could elevate you. And when you really get that chance, when things are going for you, that window opens. Now that's going to serve a purpose. You're really going to go for it. You know that this is a special moment. You've been waiting for it. So that's how I would process those setbacks.
Well, Atif, this has been a special moment. And thank you so much for joining us today for Franklin Covey C-Suite Conversations. I really appreciate the opportunity to get to know you a little bit and for you to share your insights with our listeners. I encourage them to learn more about you, to find out a bit more. But for today, I just want to say thank you so much.
You're welcome, Patrick. It's been a great discussion. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Take care of yourself. Well, folks, that's all I have for today's episode. Big thanks to Atif Rafiq for joining me for a C-Suite conversation. I so enjoyed learning about what he's learned along the way in his various roles he's had, in the various manifestations of his career. The insights he provides, I think, will help all of us to make great decisions going forward. Thanks so much for joining us. My name's Dr. Patrick Ledden. Now go make it a great day.